Let's go into the minds of some podcasters and find out how they develop their own content for their audience.
Podcasting, training and development.
Hey there, podcaster. My name is Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer, and of course, your podcast therapist. I have a podcast of the same name, The Podcast Therapist, and of course, it is very meta. Obviously, it helps podcasters create a better podcast. You can find the link for this podcast in the description of this particular video, or I'll leave a card up here so that you can go ahead and find that podcast and subscribe to it right now so that you can get some ideas for yourself, all right? In today's clip, I want to share with you some time that I had spent with my friends Vishnu and Shankar from the Writer Geek Podcast. And there was a clip inside of this interview where I thought it was interesting to share, or I actually thought it was important to share with you, the viewer of my YouTube channel, to see how other content creators or how other podcasters come up with their own content. I think this is important for other podcasters to really get wrap their minds around, because it's important to see how others develop and have the creative process on their terms. So there is no set way in which we develop content. I'm sure you know this by now, but if you don't know, there is no set way in how we create content. There is probably more efficient ways in which we can come up with content to develop a better podcast, a more efficient podcast, something that doesn't take forever to edit. But at the end of the day, it's really more about the content that we can develop that can be consumable and that is going to remain sticky. In other words, it's going to keep the listener engaged through the entire podcast program. So I wanted to share this clip with you, and it's going to be of Vishnu, and he's going to share he and his brother's process really of how they develop a podcast. Now, before we jump into that clip, I think it's important that we mention Buzzsprout, because they are the sponsor of this video that you're watching today. Buzzsprout is the podcast hosting service that I use for The Podcast Therapist. In fact, it is now the hosting service that I do recommend, not just because they are a sponsor of this video, but their services are just top-notch, world-class. And I got to tell you, when I first jumped in to launch The Podcast Therapist, I thought, well, yeah, I'll just go ahead and start something on this new platform just to test it out. But when I jumped in, I couldn't believe how easy it was to get my podcast listed in all these directories that I had no idea even existed. I knew there were some out there, but I didn't know that there were that many. So that's something that I thought was really interesting. Also, the features within Buzzsprout help you, the podcaster, get discovered. They have a transcription feature or a transcription box where you can get your podcast transcribed, and of course, put those transcriptions in that box so you can get discovered inside of these different applications or these podcatchers so your podcast can get discovered. And they recently added something called dynamic insertion or dynamic ads, where you can have a pre-roll that is before your podcast, which you probably have heard on The Podcast Therapist, but you can switch out that ad. If promotions with your sponsors, they change up over time, you don't always want to have the same ad running on the pre-roll of your podcast. And this is something that they have decided to go ahead and incorporate with their service, and it is very useful for me when I want to change out a different sponsor for a different podcast, so it's not the same all around. If you want to give Buzzsprout a try today for free 90 days, check out their website, buzzsprout.com, or there's a link down in the description that you can go ahead and check out as well. And now let's go ahead and jump on over to the clip with Vishnu and Shankar. Yeah, I was wondering about like what that structure looked like when it came down to the development of the content. Like, do you guys sit down? Do you write out bullet points? Or do you script it out? And when I've heard your podcast, I'll sometimes sit over here and I won't be sitting. I'll actually be over there cooking in the kitchen, and I'll listen to the podcast, and then I'll be like, wow, this is just like listening to a conversation of two dudes who have a vested interest in the topic, and they know a little bit about it, but they're also looking to educate the listener as well. So you have the listener in mind also when you're developing the content. Is that what every podcaster should be trying to do when they develop a podcast?
There is a problem when we sometimes when we talk to people, we assume that they are at the same level as we are when it comes to certain topics, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm trying to discuss something with Shankar, let's say we are having a conversation, I should be sitting with an assumption that he probably doesn't know anything about it, right? So when we craft our episodes, we try to start from the basics, whatever it is. It could be a science episode, it could be about Indian history. Mm-hmm. Most of the Indians should know Indian history, but we assume that, okay, some of them might not. So we start from the basics. We tend to think about the questions that might come up in their minds, right? So we don't leave anything to assumptions thinking, oh, they should be knowing it, we don't need to cover it. We try to keep that in mind, along with keeping it natural, as a flow of conversation. We are not very strict about, oh, these are the exact stuff that we should think about, and these are the exact words we should speak. No, we have a bullet point of topics to cover. Take a glance at it. Okay, this is the next thing that we need to cover. Have a conversation around it. And one other thing that I would like to add is that we don't overthink it. We are not like, hey, we have to be perfect with this. It should be like a science paper out of a university or something like that.
Yeah.
We are gonna make mistakes. We get feedback from people saying that, hey, the thing that you mentioned in last episode, it's not this, it's that. We accept it. We correct that in the next episode. So we don't take it too seriously. I mean, nobody should even take life too seriously, is what I feel.
Whoa.
That I think that keeps the fun in it. The moment we start becoming, too strict about stuff, I think you start losing interest.
All I remember when I listened to your podcast was that I gained knowledge almost immediately from the moment that I was listening to it all the way to the end, and I felt fulfilled. And the payoff of your podcast gave me not only knowledge, but entertained me as well. And I was like, okay, these guys are on to something. They're on to doing this. And then I think that was around the time when you, Vishnu, you reached out to me. And I think you had said that's when the podcast was being featured on, or someone had reached out to you from one of the local newspapers or I forget what it was. And they had said that they had found your podcast to be one of the best podcasts in India.
Yeah, I think that is exactly when we've got featured in one of the newspapers here. I think
edX
I cannot remember which one, but yeah, I think that was around the time. And coming to the knowledge part, right? That is what really one of the motivating factors as well. At least for me, I have a lot of my friends and colleagues who listen to the show. They usually, before this all this world went upside down, they used to commute from home to office. They get about half an hour of journey, right? So they used to say, hey, half an hour episode of yours, I start from home, I start playing it. By the time I'm in office, it's done and I have learned something new. Right. And we stay in the state called Karnataka, in the city of Bangalore, which is not our home state. We come from Kerala, as I mentioned earlier. So in India, the special thing about different states is that each and every state has a different language, right? So you can imagine.
Yeah, the country is divided linguistically. Yeah.
Okay.
The borders of the states are decided based on the language that you speak, right? So we come from a completely different background and language. And when we moved to Karnataka, it is a new language here called Kannada, which is a very old language, about 2,500 years old. One of the things that fascinated me was to learn about the history of Kannada, right? So while learning, we thought we'll do an episode, and we started a series called Languages. It's still, I would say it is still in progress, although we have published only one episode.
Like 2.5 years back.
Yeah, so we decided to take Kannada as the first language to discuss, and I did some research. It was really fascinating to me that to learn few of the things about the language. And when we published the episode, many native Kannada speakers from my office and my friends and even otherwise, they came back saying that we have been speaking this language since the time that we were born. But yesterday when I listened to your show is when I got to know so many things about my own language. And this is not our native language. One of the things interesting for me was how in Greek plays from 5th century had a reference and Kannada language lines within their plays. That means there was a trade between this state and Greece back in those days. So those kind of astounding historical facts, right? That is what we try to find and, put it in our show so that, so people learn something about their culture and their society and all that kind of stuff.
Right. There's a podcast here in the States, specifically within my state. It's called Valley 101. It's actually within the city of Phoenix, Arizona. And there are things, it's a podcast that is very NPR-ish, but what they talk about is they'll talk about the history of a certain location in Arizona or the city, what a monument, what the history was behind that monument, and then they'll go further and deeper, and they'll examine some of the news articles that they have written over the years because it's all affiliated with a newspaper here in town. And so those are the things that like I thought, wow, I didn't realize that about this particular mansion, or I didn't realize this about this particular mountain. And I learned something, and the podcast seems to do really well. And I think that is where, when it comes to developing and creating content, is what can you do to educate someone to becoming, I guess, a little bit better every day. And so that's what I think you guys, that's why I really like to just give you guys the kudos that you deserve for your program, because you do that so well with your listeners. So as you can see, the content creation process for Shankar and Vishnu is really based around their own curiosity and how they come up with a list of ideas or a list of topics or a list of bullet points that they want to discuss, and they have that conversation that revolves around that, and they keep the conversation very loose. And like Vishnu said, they're not too serious about their podcast. If they make a mistake, they correct it in the upcoming episode, and they don't take things too seriously. So don't be too afraid to make assertions or claims and then get them wrong in the actual podcast themselves. I do this in my own podcast, and I go back and I say, there's a correction with what we had mentioned or what I had mentioned in my previous episode. This is completely okay. So try not to take it too seriously. There will be people who will call you out on it, and that's completely fine. People have done it on this YouTube channel, and that's fine. And I have been more than willing to say, yeah, I was wrong on this, and that's completely okay. So let me know, how do you come up with your own content for your podcast? What is your particular process? Your process might help out someone who is watching this video. So I would love to hear what you have to say by leaving a comment down in the section below. Let me know what your podcast is all about, and let me know what your content creation process is all about. And of course, if you have questions, leave those comments down in the section below on this YouTube channel. And something that I want to mention real quick before I close out, as you can notice, I have a brand new shirt on here. I'm listening to you, but I'm editing out your filler words in my head. It's a brand new t-shirt that I have gone ahead and created. And if you have not noticed, there is a drawer right below this video on YouTube where you can purchase this t-shirt. So you can go ahead and grab this t-shirt. And of course, there's a podcast therapist t-shirt, and I plan on putting more t-shirts in that particular drawer. But you can go ahead and grab this t-shirt. If you are someone who is editing podcasts and you love to edit out the ums and uhs, this t-shirt has to be in your life. If you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up, and of course, hit that little bell button and the subscribe button so you can get notified when I drop a brand new video. So in the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and we'll be talking to you next time.